What if the biggest enemy of your financial life wasn't a massive debt, wasn't a bad investment, wasn't a lack of money, but something you do every single day, repeatedly, without even noticing, something so common, so normalized, so invisible that it never crossed your mind that it could be silently destroying any chance you have of building a real financial life? That's exactly what I'm going to talk to you about today. In this video, you're going to discover a behavioral pattern that shows up in the lives of most people who work hard, who push themselves, who even earn a decent income, but who reach the end of every month in the same place, the same stagnation, the same feeling that something isn't working, without being able to pinpoint exactly what. If you stay with me until the end, you'll understand not just what this habit is, but why it seems completely normal to everyone around you, and what you can do in a practical and immediate way to start eliminating this pattern from your life. But I need to warn you, what you're about to hear might surprise you. It might even make you a little uncomfortable, because the truth about what's sabotaging your financial life is much simpler, much closer, and much more powerful than any complicated explanation you've ever come across. So stay with me, because what comes next might be the turning point you didn't even know you were waiting for. Let me start with a question I want you to take seriously right now. Not as a rhetorical question, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a genuine reflection on your own life. Have you ever had the feeling that you're stuck in a place you didn't choose? That no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you push yourself, no matter how much you try to do things differently, your financial situation seems to have an invisible ceiling that won't let you break through, that you do achieve some things along the way? A promotion, a little extra income, some unexpected money that came in, but that somehow, mysteriously, that progress always fades, always dissolves, always leaves you right back at square one. If you recognize yourself in that description, I want you to know something very important before anything else. This is not your weakness. It's not a lack of ability. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not a lack of effort. It's a pattern, a silent, specific, invisible pattern that operates in your financial behavior every single day without you noticing. And that has a devastating power precisely because it looks completely normal. Because everyone around you is living this same pattern. And when something is done by everyone, we stop questioning whether it's right or wrong. We simply assume that's just how things work. And that's exactly where the problem lives. So let me ask you, have you ever stopped to consider that maybe the problem isn't what you're doing wrong in the big financial decisions, but in the small behaviors you repeat every day without even realizing it? Because that's where the story changes completely. Most people, when they think about financial problems, think about big things. They think about enormous debts. They think about investments that went wrong. They think about economic crises, unemployment, dramatic events that turned life upside down. And it's true that those things exist and that they carry a tremendous weight in anyone's financial life. But financial psychology shows us something that goes completely against what most people believe. Big financial problems rarely come from big events. They come from small behaviors repeated over time, from habits that seem harmless in the moment they happen, but that added together, multiplied by time, create an effect that can be absolutely devastating. It's like that story about the drop of water that wears away the stone. Each individual drop does nothing on its own. But the repetition, the consistency, the persistence of that drop day after day creates a hole that no direct force could ever create. Your financial habits work exactly the same way. Each small behavior seems irrelevant in the moment it happens. But the daily repetition of those behaviors over months, over years, over decades, creates a financial reality that can either trap you or free you depending on what those habits are. And the question I'm asking is, have you ever honestly investigated what your daily financial habits actually are? Not the big plans, not the big intentions, but the small behaviors that happen on autopilot without you even having to think about them. Think about a situation with me that I'm willing to bet you'll recognize. Imagine someone who works hard, who is dedicated to their career, who isn't an obvious big spender, who doesn't have outrageous debts, who every now and then even tries to save something, but who at the end of the month always arrives at that same tight spot, who, when an investment opportunity shows up, doesn't have money available. Who, when an emergency comes along, has to scramble for a loan or reach for a credit card because there's no reserve? Who looks at the future and feels an anxiety that's hard to name because they know that if things keep going this way, 10 years from now, they'll be in exactly the same place. This person is not irresponsible, not lazy, not lacking intelligence. They simply never realize that there's a specific habit, silent, completely normalized by society, that is quietly consuming every possibility of financial progress they could have. And this habit has nothing to do with the size of the paycheck. Because this same pattern exists in the lives of people who earn very little and in the lives of people who earn a great deal. It adapts to whatever income is available. It scales. And that's exactly why getting a raise without changing the pattern never solves the problem. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever seen it happen to someone, or maybe even to yourself, where the income went up but the financial situation stayed the same or even got worse? And now I want to tell you what this habit is. Not in an abstract way, not with complicated psychological jargon, but directly and clearly, because you deserve to understand this without any beating around the bush. The silent habit that is sabotaging the financial life of most people is reactive spending. What is reactive spending? It's the tendency to use money as an emotional response to what's happening in the moment, instead of using it intentionally and in alignment with long-term goals. It's spending in reaction to an emotion, whether that emotion is good or bad. It's buying when you're happy, to celebrate. It's buying when you're sad, to comfort yourself. It's spending when you're anxious, to distract yourself. It's acquiring things that weren't planned because a sale appeared, because someone mentioned something, because you saw it on social media, because you felt like it in the moment. It's financial behavior being guided by the emotions of the present instead of being guided by a clear vision of the future you want to build. And the most insidious thing about this pattern is that it doesn't look wrong. Each individual purchase seems justifiable. Each expense has a reason that makes sense in the moment. But the whole picture, the sum of all those small reactive expenses over time, creates a constant financial leak that prevents any solid foundation from being built. Can you identify this pattern in your life? Do you buy in response to emotions more often than in response to conscious planning? Behavioral psychology has a very specific name for the mechanism behind reactive spending: immediate gratification. It's the tendency of the human brain to place far more value on present pleasure than on future benefit. And this is not a moral flaw. It's a neurological characteristic that was installed in the human brain over millions of years of evolution. In prehistoric times, this tendency was fundamental to survival. When food was available, you ate. When there was water, you drank. You didn't hold back resources for the future because the future was completely uncertain. The present was what mattered. The problem is that this ancient neurological system, which made perfect sense when the threat was a lion or a food shortage, operates with the same logic in a modern society where threats and opportunities take completely different forms. In today's world, your brain sees a sale on an online store and activates the same urgency system it used to activate when it spotted available food on the savannah. It says, "Take advantage now. This opportunity might not be here tomorrow," and you buy. Not because you calculated that this purchase makes sense in the context of your financial goals, but because the primitive brain made the decision before the rational part had time to process it. And this process happens dozens of times a day, at different scales, creating a pattern of reactive spending that drains financial resources constantly and invisibly. Have you ever caught your mind doing this? Have you ever felt that urgency to take advantage of a deal, to buy now, not to let it slip away, even without having planned that purchase at all? But reactive spending goes far beyond impulse buying. It shows up in more subtle forms that most people never associate with a financial problem. It shows up in the decision to go out to eat when you're too tired to cook, not because you'd planned it, but because the exhaustion of the day created an emotional need for relief. It shows up in the subscription to a service you rarely use, but that feels wrong to cancel, because someday you might need it. It shows up in clothes that sit in the closet with the tag still on because you bought them in a moment of excitement and later realized you didn't need them. It shows up in the over-the-top gift you give someone because you felt guilty about something. It shows up in the renovation that wasn't planned, but that you started because you began feeling like you deserved a better environment. It shows up in the car traded in ahead of schedule because the status the current car provided was no longer satisfying the emotional need you didn't even know you were trying to fill. Each of these examples has an emotion at its root. And each of them can have a rational justification built around it after the decision has already been made. But the reality is that the decision wasn't made by reason, it was made by emotion. And that is reactive spending in its most real, most everyday, most devastatingly normal form. Can you identify any of these patterns in your own financial history? What was the last purchase you made that was responding to an emotion rather than to a plan? Now I need to talk about something that amplifies reactive spending in a way that few people notice. The environment we live in was designed to exploit exactly this vulnerability of the human brain. Marketing companies, social media platforms, physical and online stores, all of them invest billions of dollars every year to understand how the human brain works and to create experiences that trigger reactive spending in increasingly efficient ways. The sale notification that arrives at the exact moment you're bored. The store layout that makes you walk through the section of products that weren't on your list before you reach what you actually came for. The recommendation algorithm that shows you exactly the product you mentioned in a private conversation. The countdown timer on the screen saying only 3 units are left. The one-click buy button that eliminates any friction between the impulse and the action. All of this is psychology applied to consumption. And it is far more sophisticated and far more effective than most people realize. You're not fighting against your own lack of discipline. You're fighting against entire systems designed by experts in human behavior specifically to overcome your resistance. I'm not saying this to give you an excuse, but to give you the clarity that the fight is real and that winning it requires awareness and strategy, not just willpower. So I ask you, have you ever stopped to notice how many times a day you're exposed to some kind of stimulus that was deliberately created to make you spend? And how many times you respond to those stimuli without even realizing it? There's another element of reactive spending that is particularly powerful, and that I need you to understand, because it operates at an even deeper level than simple buying impulses. It's identity-based spending. This happens when you buy not because you need the product, not because you're responding to a momentary emotion, but because the product represents who you believe you are or who you want others to believe you are. You buy clothes from a specific brand not because the quality justifies the price, but because wearing that brand says something about you to the world. You buy a particular model of car not because it better serves your transportation needs, but because it communicates a status, a level of arrival, an image you want to project. You frequent certain restaurants, certain places. You acquire certain products not for their intrinsic value, but for what they say about you. And this happens because human beings are fundamentally social animals. Identity, for our brains, is deeply connected to belonging to a group. And consumption has become, in modern society, one of the primary languages for communicating identity and belonging. The financial problem isn't in having preferences. The problem is when those preferences are financed in a way that compromises a person's real financial health, because the emotional need to communicate an identity becomes more urgent than the rational need to build a solid financial foundation. Have you ever bought something primarily for what it communicates about you? For the status, the image, the belonging it represents? There's an additional force that feeds reactive spending in a very powerful way, and it has a very simple name: social comparison. Human beings have an evolutionary tendency to compare themselves to the people around them in order to evaluate their own position within the group. That was useful for centuries. But in today's world, with social media exponentially amplifying exposure to other people's lifestyles, achievements, and consumption patterns, this tendency is transformed into a constant source of dissatisfaction and reactive financial behavior. When you see a friend posting photos of an international trip, something inside you gets activated. Not necessarily envy in the negative sense, but a sense of reference, of where you should be, of what you should have, of what's missing in your life. And that sense of reference makes you make financial decisions based not on your concrete reality and your specific goals, but on the perception that you're falling behind compared to others. You book a vacation package that wasn't in your budget. You buy new clothes before an event so you don't look out of date. You go to places above your current financial standard to maintain an appearance of prosperity. And all of this happens reactively, in response to comparison, not in response to genuine planning. And the worst part of all, the people you're comparing yourself to are probably also comparing themselves to others and also living beyond their real means. It's a race where nobody quite knows where they're running to, but everyone is running with a credit card in hand. Can you identify moments when comparison with others influenced a financial decision you made? When you spent money to maintain an appearance or to avoid falling behind some external reference point? Now, I need to tell you about something that behavioral neuroscience calls present bias, and which is probably the most relevant psychological mechanism for understanding why reactive spending is so hard to fight. Present bias is the tendency of the brain to give disproportionate weight to what's happening right now compared to what will happen in the future. Research shows that when the human brain thinks about the future, it activates the same neural areas it uses when thinking about another person. In other words, from a neurological standpoint, your future self is almost like a stranger to your present self, and you naturally care less about the well-being of a stranger than about your own well-being right now. This explains why it's so hard to give up a present pleasure in the name of a future benefit. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not a lack of willpower. It's your brain operating exactly as it was designed to operate. The financial problem arises when this present bias is so strong that you systematically sacrifice the future in favor of the present, making spending decisions that give you immediate relief or pleasure, but that undermine the construction of a solid financial life over time. And the fundamental question I'm putting to you here is, when you make a financial decision, are you thinking primarily about the immediate impact or the long-term impact of that decision? Which one weighs more when it's time to choose? There's a classic psychology experiment called the marshmallow test, conducted by researcher Walter Mischel, that illustrates this concept perfectly. In the experiment, young children were placed in a room with a marshmallow in front of them. The researcher said, "You can eat this marshmallow now, or you can wait 15 minutes and I'll give you 2. Most of the children couldn't wait. They ate the marshmallow immediately. And what the follow-up studies of those children over decades revealed was that the ability to delay gratification in childhood was correlated with better outcomes in various areas of adult life, including the financial. Now, I'm not saying that your capacity for delay is fixed by childhood and can't change. Quite the opposite. Modern psychology shows that the ability to delay gratification is a skill that can be developed, strengthened, and trained throughout life. But to develop it, you first need to recognize that it's at play. You need to notice when present bias is dominating your financial decisions. And you need concrete tools to create a pause, a space between the impulse and the action, where the rational part of the brain has the chance to participate in the decision. And I ask you directly, do you have the habit of creating a pause before making unplanned financial decisions? Or do most of your expenses happen on autopilot without that reflective pause? Let me tell you now about a concept I consider absolutely central to any real financial transformation, and that is directly connected to the problem of reactive spending. It's the concept of financial intentionality. Financial intentionality is not the same thing as a budget. It's not the same thing as a spreadsheet. It's not the same thing as financial control in the bureaucratic sense of the word. Financial intentionality is the practice of making financial decisions with clarity of purpose, aligned with values and goals you've consciously defined, instead of making decisions in response to impulses, emotions, or external stimuli. It's the difference between using money and being used by money. An intentional person with money doesn't necessarily spend less. They spend differently. They spend on things that genuinely matter to them, that are aligned with what they want to build in life. And they systematically decline the expenses that are just reactions to emotional stimuli of the moment. And the most interesting thing is that this shift doesn't require extreme sacrifice or deprivation. It requires awareness. It requires clarity about what you truly value. It requires the capacity to distinguish between what you genuinely want and what you're being led to want by external forces. Do you have clarity about what you genuinely value in life? Not what you think you should value, not what others expect you to value, but what you, truly, at your core, consider important and meaningful? There's something that financial psychology calls decision fatigue, and it's a factor that's often ignored when talking about financial behavior. Decision fatigue is the phenomenon where the quality of your decisions deteriorates as you make more decisions throughout the day. This happens because making decisions requires cognitive energy, and that energy is limited. Research shows that judges make more favorable decisions for defendants right after a break, and far harsher decisions after long sessions. Executives approve riskier projects at the end of the day than at the start of the morning. And consumers make far more impulsive purchasing decisions when they're tired than when they're rested. This means that the time of day, your stress level, how much you've already decided before arriving at that moment, all of this directly influences the quality of your financial decisions. That's why making large purchases after an exhausting day of work is a recipe for reactive spending. That's why long holiday weekend sales work so well. People are mentally depleted and have their guard down. And that's why creating routines and systems that reduce the number of financial decisions you need to make on autopilot is so important. Have you ever noticed how your level of tiredness affects the quality of your financial decisions? Do you make different spending decisions when you're rested versus when you're exhausted? Now I want to talk about another aspect of reactive spending that is rarely discussed, but that has an enormous impact: consumption as emotional regulation. This happens when you use the act of buying, of spending, of acquiring, not for the value of the product itself, but as a way of managing emotional states that you don't know how to, can't, or don't want to deal with in another way. This is what psychology calls using consumption as a coping mechanism. And it's far more common than most people admit. When you come home after a terrible day, and the first thing you do is open a shopping app, that's emotional regulation through consumption. When you receive bad news and head to the mall, that's emotional regulation through consumption. When you're anxious about the future, and that purchase seems to bring a momentary feeling of control or reward, that's emotional regulation through consumption. And the problem isn't only financial. The problem is that consumption as emotional regulation doesn't resolve the emotion that generated it. It only postpones it temporarily, often creating a new financial problem that will generate more stress, which will create more need for emotional regulation, which will generate more spending. It's a cycle that feeds itself, and breaking it requires not just a change in financial behavior, but developing other ways to handle difficult emotions. What are the emotions that make you spend the most? Sadness, anxiety, boredom, anger, loneliness. Identifying the specific emotional trigger is the first step toward developing alternative responses that don't compromise your financial health. There's a very concrete, very simple practice that behavioral psychology has validated as highly effective for interrupting the pattern of reactive spending, and I want you to know about it right now. It's the intentional pause rule. The idea is simple. Every time you feel the impulse to make an unplanned purchase, especially ones above a certain dollar amount that you define for yourself, you create a deliberate pause before acting. This pause can be 24 hours, 48 hours, or a week, depending on the amount involved. During this pause, you don't act. You let the impulse exist without immediately following it. And what research shows is that a huge percentage of these impulses simply dissolve during the pause. The desire passes. The urgency that felt real disappears. And you realize that what seemed like a need was actually just an emotional reaction of the moment. This practice doesn't eliminate all spending, nor should it. It eliminates reactive spending, the spending that happens before the conscious and rational part of your mind has a chance to participate in the decision. And the beauty of this practice is that it doesn't require forced deprivation. You can buy anything that survives the pause, but you'll be surprised by how much doesn't survive. Are you willing to try this practice, to create a deliberate pause before any unplanned purchase for 1 week and observe what happens? Now I need to tell you about something that goes beyond behavior and reaches the deepest psychological root of the problem. Because reactive spending, like any persistent behavioral pattern, always has an underlying belief sustaining it. And that belief, in most cases, is related to how you see yourself in relation to what you deserve, what is possible for you, and what money represents in your life. For many people, reactive spending is fed by a belief that has never been consciously articulated, but that operates as a hidden directive in financial decision-making. That belief says something like, "The present is the only safe moment. The future is too uncertain to plan for. So it's better to enjoy what I have now than to save for a tomorrow that might never come." This belief may have been formed by real experiences of loss, of instability, of moments when the promised future never materialized. And it's completely understandable from an emotional standpoint. But it's devastating from a financial standpoint because it transforms immediate spending into an emotional survival strategy that systematically undermines the construction of any more stable future. Do you recognize this belief in yourself? Is there a part of you that believes it's better to spend now than to save for later because the future is uncertain? Where did that belief come from? What experiences in your life built that conviction? There's another belief that feeds reactive spending in a very specific way, and it's very common among people who grew up in financially scarce environments. It's the belief that money saved is money that will disappear somehow, that there's no point in saving because something always comes along to eat up the reserve. That investing is for people who already have a lot, not for those who are still building, that the effort of saving won't pay off because something will go wrong. This belief creates a very particular behavior. When money comes in, you spend it quickly, because deep down, there's a feeling that if you don't spend it now, it'll be gone anyway. And this feeling, which looks like financial pessimism, is actually a kind of emotional protection. If you spend before you lose, at least the loss was on something you chose. At least you got to enjoy it. And so the cycle continues. Money comes in and goes out quickly. The reserve never forms, and the belief confirms itself with every cycle. Money just never stays. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever had the feeling that saving money is pointless because it goes away regardless? Have you ever spent quickly after receiving money because deep down it seemed like if you didn't spend it soon, you'd lose it some other way? Now I want to talk about something very practical, very concrete, which is the creation of what I call personal financial intention. And this is not a budget plan, it's not a spreadsheet, it's a clear answer to a fundamental question. What is money for in my life? Not in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the concrete, personal sense. What do I want to build with the money that passes through my life? What is the future I want to create? What are the experiences that truly matter to me? What is the legacy I want to leave? What are the concrete needs I want to ensure? When you have clear and specific answers to these questions, financial behavior changes in nature. Money stops being something that comes and goes without direction and starts having a destination you defined. And when money has a destination you genuinely care about, resisting reactive spending becomes much easier. Not because you became more disciplined, but because now you have something concrete and meaningful competing with the impulse of the moment. Do you have clarity about what money is for in your life? Do you have a specific vision of the future you're trying to build? Or has money been passing through your life without a clear destination, going wherever the impulse of the moment sends it? Let's talk about something that is very important within the context of reactive spending, which is the relationship between self-esteem and spending. Because one of the deepest roots of consumption as emotional regulation lies in fragile self-esteem. When a person doesn't feel good enough, valued enough, seen and recognized enough in the world, consumption can function as an attempt to fill that void. You buy an expensive piece of clothing because it makes you feel more valuable. You go to a restaurant above your standard because the environment makes you feel more sophisticated. You give extravagant gifts because generosity is a way of feeling loved and accepted. You acquire the latest technology products because they communicate an intelligence and a status that you feel you need to demonstrate. And all of this has completely understandable emotional logic. The problem is that the relief that consumption brings to fragile self-esteem is always temporary. The clothes stop being new. The meal ends. The gift doesn't guarantee love. The product becomes outdated. And the need to be enough, to be seen, to be valued, continues. And it asks for more spending. And the cycle perpetuates itself. The real transformation happens when you start working on self-esteem from the inside out, not from the outside in. When you find ways to feel valuable and sufficient that don't depend on buying anything. And I ask you with respect and sincerity, is there any area of your life where you use consumption to feel more valuable, more seen, more recognized? Because recognizing that is an enormous act of courage, and it's the first step toward real change. I need to talk now about a point that is crucial and that many people miss when trying to change financial behavior: the difference between restriction and redirection. Many people try to fight reactive spending through pure restriction. I'll stop spending on this. I'll cut that out. I'll say no to everything. And this approach has a fundamental problem. It treats the symptom, not the cause. And it creates such a great internal tension that it's inevitable that it will break at some point. Restriction without redirection is like holding your breath. You can do it for a while, but the moment you let go is going to be explosive. And then you compensate for everything you didn't buy, and you end up in a worse situation than before. Redirection is different. Instead of simply saying no to reactive spending, you redirect the energy that was generating it towards something that also satisfies a real emotional need, but in a way that is aligned with your financial goals. Instead of buying when you're sad, you find another way to process the sadness. Instead of spending when you're anxious, you find another way to manage the anxiety. Instead of consuming for status, you find other ways to feel valuable and seen. And while doing that, you direct the money that used to go to reactive spending towards something that builds the future you want. This requires self-knowledge. It requires the willingness to look at the emotions behind financial behavior and find healthy ways to meet them. Have you ever tried to fight reactive spending through pure restriction? How did it go? Did it work in the long run? There's a concept in behavioral economics that I need you to know because it explains a great deal of why reactive spending is so hard to notice and to change. It's the concept of behavioral blind spot. A behavioral blind spot is an area of your own behavior that you simply cannot see objectively because you're inside it. You can't see the pattern because it's so familiar, so much a part of your normal functioning that it seems invisible. It's like trying to see your own face without a mirror. You know the face is there, but you need a reflective surface to see it from the outside. The same thing happens with financial behavior. Many people have patterns of reactive spending that are completely invisible to themselves, but that are obvious to any outside observer. And that's why self-knowledge is so central to this transformation, but it's not sufficient on its own. Sometimes you need an outside perspective, whether from a professional, from a tool that helps you observe your own behavior from the outside, or from a community of people going through the same process. The behavioral blind spot also explains why simply receiving information about personal finance rarely changes behavior. You can know everything about financial education and still continue with the same patterns because knowledge isn't the problem. The behavioral pattern running beneath the surface is the problem. Have you ever tried to learn about personal finance and noticed that the knowledge wasn't translating into behavioral change? What happened? Now let's talk about a practical and powerful tool you can start using immediately: the Emotional Financial Journal. This is not a spending spreadsheet. It's not an income and expense tracker. It's a record of the emotions associated with financial decisions. The practice is simple. Every time you make a purchase, especially an unplanned one, you record not just the amount, but how you were feeling before buying, what the emotional trigger was, and how you felt after the purchase. This creates a mirror that many people have never had access to before. Over time, patterns begin to emerge with crystal clarity. You'll notice that you buy more on certain days of the week after certain types of interactions in response to specific emotions. And when you can see the pattern clearly, half the work is already done, Because what you can see, you can change. Visibility is the first instrument of transformation. Without it, you're trying to drive in the dark. With it, you start to have real control over where you're going. Would you be willing to try this for a month, to record not just the expenses, but the emotions that were present in each relevant financial decision? Because the patterns that emerge may surprise you deeply. I need to tell you about something that goes beyond the individual and is equally important: the role of the physical and social environment in financial behavior. Behavioral psychology shows that the environment you live in and the people you spend time with influence your financial decisions in ways that are often completely invisible to you. If your physical environment is full of consumption triggers, like active shopping app notifications, credit cards always within reach and visible, favorite stores on your way to work, promotions constantly arriving in your email, you're creating a minefield where any step can trigger reactive spending. And if your social environment is composed primarily of people who normalize spending above their real means, who are always acquiring new things, who use spending as a form of socializing, who find it strange when someone chooses not to participate in an expensive outing, that environment is going to create constant social pressure on your financial behavior. Changing the environment is often more effective than trying to change behavior within an environment that hasn't changed. Remove physical triggers. Create friction between the impulse and the action, such as uninstalling shopping apps from your phone, removing credit card information from online shopping platforms, leaving the card at home when going to certain places, and, when possible, cultivate relationships with people who have a healthier and more intentional relationship with money. Have you ever thought about how your physical and social environment is influencing your financial behavior? What are the triggers in your environment that most feed reactive spending? I want to talk now about something that is fundamental and that many people skip when trying to change their financial life: defining where the money should go. Because fighting reactive spending without having a clear destination for the money that's being redirected is like stopping running in one direction without knowing which path you want to take. You stop, but you don't go anywhere. The money that used to go toward reactive spending needs a new destination, one you chose consciously, that is aligned with your values and with the future you want to build. This could be an emergency fund that gives you real financial security. It could be the beginning of an investment that will work for you over time. It could be paying off a debt that is eroding your financial freedom. It could be building capital that will fund a project you have for your life. Whatever it is, it needs to be specific. It needs to be yours. It needs to genuinely matter to you. Not to your neighbor, not to the social standard, but to you. And when you have that clear destination, every time you resist a reactive purchase, you're not simply depriving yourself. You're actively choosing the future you want. You're voting, with your money, for the future you believe is possible for you. Do you have a clear destination defined for the money you're redirecting away from reactive spending? If not, that might be the first thing to build. Let's talk about something I consider one of the most transformative points of this entire conversation, which is the relationship between the present you choose and the future you create. Because every financial decision you make today is a vote for the future. Not in the abstract sense, in the literal sense, when you choose not to make a reactive purchase and direct that money toward a reserve, you are creating, in a concrete and measurable way, a different version of your financial future. When you choose to make that reactive purchase, you are, equally concretely, choosing to continue in the same cycle. I'm not saying you should never spend on anything that isn't strictly necessary. That's not life. That's pointless deprivation. I'm saying that the quality of your financial future is built by the consistency of your present choices, and that small changes, maintained with consistency over time, have an immense cumulative power. The compound effect works for both good and bad. Just as the interest on a debt grows exponentially over time, intentional financial decisions repeated consistently also grow exponentially, only in the direction you want. Can you visualize what your financial future would look like if you changed just a few small behaviors and maintained them for 5-10 years? Can you imagine what would be different? We've reached a very important point in our conversation, which is talking about what psychology calls financial self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that you are capable of executing the behaviors necessary to reach a goal. And financial self-efficacy is the specific belief that you are capable of changing your financial patterns, of building a different financial life, of learning and applying new ways of dealing with money. When financial self-efficacy is low, the person gives up before they try. They don't believe they're capable of changing, so they don't start. Or they start and give up at the first obstacle, because the first obstacle confirms the belief that they weren't capable. Self-efficacy develops through small victories. Every time you act differently, every time you resist a reactive purchase, every time you make an intentional financial decision, you're building evidence that you are capable. And that evidence, accumulated over time, transforms the belief. You start to see yourself as someone who is capable of having a different relationship with money. And when the identity changes, behavior changes in a more natural and sustainable way. That's why starting small is so important. Not because big changes don't matter, but because small changes build the belief that big changes are possible. When was the last time you made an intentional financial decision that made you feel capable and confident? That gave you evidence that you are capable of having a different relationship with money. Now I need to address a topic that is sensitive, but that's impossible to avoid in an honest conversation about financial psychology. The role of shame in the cycle of reactive spending. Financial shame, which is the feeling that you are fundamentally inadequate when it comes to money, that you are the problem, that you're beyond help, that everyone else manages to do it but you, this shame is one of the biggest feeders of the cycle we've been discussing. Because when you feel ashamed of your financial behavior, you don't want to look at it. You avoid the bank statement, you avoid the credit card bill, you avoid any conversation about money. And that avoidance doesn't solve the problem, it allows it to grow. And in the space that shame creates between you and your financial reality, reactive spending flourishes because there isn't enough awareness to interrupt it. Beyond that, shame itself is an extremely uncomfortable emotion, and one of the ways many people use to relieve uncomfortable emotions is exactly consumption. So shame generates reactive spending, which generates more reasons for shame, which generates more reactive spending. It's a cycle that feeds on the very pain that should be signaling that something needs to change. The way out is not more shame. The way out is compassion. It's looking at your financial patterns with curiosity and with the intention to understand and change, not with judgment and self-punishment. Have you been treating yourself with compassion when you have a financial slip? Or has self-criticism been the dominant tone? Because how you treat yourself after a financial mistake will largely determine whether you'll be able to change the pattern. Let me tell you about something very concrete and very practical now. The creation of automatic systems that work in favor of your financial goals even when your emotional state in the moment isn't cooperating. This is what behavioral finance experts call behavioral design. The idea is simple and powerful. Instead of relying on willpower and motivation, which vary enormously from day to day, you create systems and structures that make the right financial behavior happen automatically, without you needing to make an active decision every time. The automatic transfer to savings or to an investment on payday is one example. When the money goes out before you see it, it doesn't compete with any consumption impulse. It's already been redirected to the destination you chose deliberately in a moment of clarity, and it doesn't need any new decision every time a paycheck comes in. Creating a separate account for specific goals is another example. When the money is physically separated and less accessible, reactive spending has an additional barrier that needs to be overcome, and this barrier, even if small, is enough to interrupt many impulses. Automating debt payments also removes the active decision and the possibility of postponing. Have you ever thought about how you could automate part of your financial behavior to reduce the reliance on willpower in your day-to-day life? I want to talk about something that seems small but has an enormous impact: the quality of your relationship with the present moment. One of the reasons reactive spending is so prevalent in modern life is that many people have a real difficulty being present without an external distraction. Consumption works as a way to escape the present, to distract yourself, to create a sense of movement and novelty when the present feels empty, monotonous, or distressing. And if that's true for you, then part of the solution to reactive spending lies in developing a greater capacity to be present, to find satisfaction and meaning in the current moment without needing an external stimulus for that. Meditation, mindfulness practice, activities that put you in a state of flow, genuine relational connections, are all ways of developing this capacity for presence that naturally reduces the need for consumption as an escape. Not because these practices make you ascetic or indifferent to material pleasures, but because when you're genuinely present and satisfied with what is real in your life, the need to seek satisfaction in external things naturally diminishes. Do you have spaces in your life where you are genuinely present without the mediation of consumption, activities, relationships, moments that satisfy you without needing to buy anything? We're reaching the final part of our conversation, and I want to bring you a vision that is at once very concrete and very transformative. Everything we've talked about today points to a reality that financial psychology confirms consistently. Lasting financial change doesn't start in the wallet, it starts in the mind. It starts at the level of the beliefs you carry about what is possible for you, about what you deserve, about what money represents in your life. It starts at the level of emotions, learning to identify which emotions are driving your financial decisions and developing healthier ways of dealing with them. It starts at the level of identity, rebuilding the narrative about what kind of person you are in relation to money. And it starts at the level of intentionality, developing clarity about what you genuinely want to build and using that clarity to guide every financial decision in your daily life. This doesn't mean that change is easy. It means that it is possible. And it means that you have far more control over it than you probably imagine. Because the pattern that's trapping you is not a sentence, it's a habit. And habits, with awareness, intention, and the right tools, can be changed. The question isn't whether change is possible. The question is, are you willing to begin? So as we reach the end, I want to leave you with the core ideas I want you to carry from here. The first is that reactive spending is the silent habit that is sabotaging your financial life, not the big wrong decisions, but the small repeated behaviors that add up to a constant leak. The second is that this habit has deep emotional roots, and fighting it requires more than willpower or restriction. It requires self-knowledge and the development of alternative ways of dealing with the emotions that feed it. The third is that financial intentionality, knowing where money is going and why, is the real alternative to reactive spending. And the fourth is that change begins now, with the smallest possible action, with the briefest pause before an impulse, with a single entry in an emotional journal, with a single automatic transfer set up. Because the trajectory changes when the first different action is taken, and that action can happen today. Tell me in the comments, what was the biggest insight you had here today? And what is your biggest challenge when it comes to money? Because your answer is going to help me create more and more content that makes real sense for your life. I'm here for that, genuinely, video by video, conversation by conversation. Until next time. Next.